Hello, and welcome to Communicate to Lead, the podcast that empowers leaders and aspiring leaders to communicate with clarity and impact. I'm Keely Belton, CEO and successful entrepreneur, and your host for today. I'm here to equip you with all the essential tools and strategies to master effective communication and lead your team to success. As the founder and CEO of The Tailored Approach, my goal is to empower you to be the best leader you can be. So sit back, relax, and join me in today's episode as we dive into the art of communicating like a true leader. My guest today is Jackie Broussard. Jackie believes that people thrive when curiosity is allowed to flourish. In her work as founder and CEO of Jackie Broussard Consulting, she empowers leaders to transform differences into strengths for maximum innovation and positive change. With a double major in international relations and Spanish and an international master of business administration, which I've never heard about, so this is really cool. Jackie loves culture and language. She speaks Spanish and German. She has consulted for Fortune 500 companies and nonprofits on international change projects in Mexico, Panama, the Dominican Republic, China, Costa Rica, Spain, and Germany. It's all a mouthful. So I'm really excited about our conversation today, Jackie. And to help teams develop a shared language with which to talk about differences, Jackie uses tools such as intercultural development inventory, IDI, and the intercultural conflict style inventory, ICSI. With over 2 decades of consulting, coaching, and strategy experience, Jackie has helped leaders at universities, nonprofits, and for-profit organizations reach their goals. From recruiting and retaining diverse and qualified candidates to co-creating more inclusive organizational culture, to developing strategy that achieves data-driven sustainable change. Jackie, I am so incredibly excited to have you on the show. I know we've been trying to make this happen for the last 3 months, and we are finally here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Keely. I'm really excited too, and have been looking forward to this for about a month and a half now, and so glad that we could get it on the books.
Yes. So let's kick it right off. Tell us more about yourself and what inspired you to start your business, Jackie Broussard Consulting.
Okay. Well, Jackie Broussard, I am a lifelong learner. I'm a bibliophile. I love books. I love reading. I'm solar powered. And so you can imagine how I suffer in the winter. And yeah, so I started my business basically because I would say that I'm a serial entrepreneur at this point. I think officially it's my 3rd business. And although I say that my first 2 were like my starter businesses, well, particularly my first one, I basically got into consulting, founding Jackie Broussard Consulting out of this need that I saw. I was working in international education as a program leader, leading students on their study abroad semesters and years in other countries. And also I was a professor of courses, including politics, identity, and equity, and intro to international business. So I was teaching those students in this cultural exchange study abroad setting. And I realized that looking back on my first study abroad experience, which was when I was in college, I left home for the first time and I studied for 1 year in Spain, Madrid, Spain. And I realized that a lot of the challenges that existed in terms of international education becoming inclusive, something that students from all different variety of backgrounds felt that was something for them, those same challenges still existed, here 20 something odd years later. And so I was basically side hustling, consulting and training for these international education organizations while I was doing this work. And then I realized, I think I want to go into business doing this work and helping organizations do this. So that's how I started Jackie Broussard Consulting. And that was 4 years ago. It's so crazy to say because it was January 2021 when I quit my full-time job and started my business.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. That's a whole lot. You said a few things that I want to get back to as we get into our conversation. You know, you mentioned, and I remember reading this from your bio, talking about differences, talking about inclusion, talking about how do we navigate all this? And it's so wonderful that you have taught courses on how to help people navigate all of this. In your experience, what are some common communication challenges that leaders are facing today, and how can they overcome them?
Yeah. So common challenges I find are an approach to cultural differences. There's lots of different ways that we approach difference, right? Like we've all been confronted with cultural differences. People who grew up differently from us or in different places or maybe with a different native tongue. And even just kind of navigating our day, right? So, you know, we might go to the grocery store or walk around our neighborhood and then we encounter people who are culturally different from us. And so I'll back up and tell you that there is this thing called intercultural competence that it really explains how we relate to those differences, right? And so it's this objective, quantifiable measurement that tells us what are the different ways that we relate to something different. And in essence, it's basically coping mechanisms, right? How do we cope with something that is potentially stressful, which is, oh, there's this person that I'm not sure how to relate to. And so there's lots of different ways that we do that, right? So there's those different coping mechanisms. They can be, well, I'm going to deny that those differences exist. Or in other words, really downplay and just maybe not even acknowledge the differences. There's another coping mechanism that it's like a us versus them, right? So it's like there's this stark contrast. So we're either all alike or we're all different, right? And so it's like this idea that either they are better, more efficient, or whatever than us, or they are, you know, all the negative aspects. So it's like worse or that or the other. And then there is the coping mechanism of minimization, which is what we call when people tend to say, yes, you know, yeah, there are some differences there, but, you know, they're not that important, right? Let's focus on what we have in common because that's what we can manage. Like that's what's going to bring us together. And let's just kind of ignore those other differences. And so all these different approaches are coping mechanisms to difference are what impact managers in terms of how they relate to, you know, their teams within their organizations, how they relate to their stakeholders, their customers, their the communities that they're serving, their students, et cetera. And so going back to your question, so I think that the biggest challenges are related to those coping mechanisms.
Ooh, okay. So that's huge. That's a whole lot of things to deal with. I heard you say, and it's a new term to me, the intercultural competence, because the one that I'm familiar with as a communication specialist is the intercultural communications and how that plays out. I heard you say the different approaches, us versus them versus we're all alike.
Yes.
If you could offer one tip, and I know I'm minimizing this, I'm trying to distill this down to one thing, but if you could give managers 1 to 2 tips around navigating this context, what would that be?
Well, first of all, I would say just becoming more aware of the huge impact that our cultural foundations have on the way that we see the world, right? So the influence that, you know, where we grew up, the stories that we grew up hearing from our parents, their experiences, their parents' experiences, all of that history that each individual brings, like really acknowledging and understanding better the huge impact that those influences have on the way we operate today, right? So on our values, our attitudes, our behaviors, the way we think about communication, the way we resolve conflict, all of those things are kind of part and parcel to each of us as individuals. So realizing that we come with this whole history into whatever space we're in, right? So, and starting to understand more about our own cultural lenses. So I think that's like a huge tip in terms of places to start. Cultural self, there are two aspects of intercultural competence, right? There is cultural self-understanding and cultural other understanding. And I think always starting with self is the best place to start, right? Understanding our own stories. What are the impact that they've had on my views and my values? Asking yourself, what are my values? And what values did I learn growing up in terms of, what it means to communicate well, what it means to be a good leader, how to handle conflict, and those kinds of things. Asking yourself, what kind of assumptions am I making or do I tend to make about people on my team that are different from me, right? And how might those assumptions be impacting my leadership? And who on my team might experience the workplace differently than I do. So I think those are all good, like reflection questions as a way to get started.
Oh, I love that. That's really helpful because I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of self-awareness. That's where we start. When we understand who we are, where we come from, what we've experienced, how that impacts what we do, how we show up, what we say, we are in a better place and position to start understanding those around us. So I think as leaders, when we are able to really stand strong in our self-awareness, it empowers us to manage our teams, to collaborate with others. And instead of feeling threatened or trying to minimize the differences, it gives us an opportunity to really use that as a strength, the differences that we have.
Yes. And I love that word that you use, empowerment, because it really is an empowerment tool. Self-understanding is a form of self-empowerment, right? I think a lot of people make the mistake of, because typically a lot of times people will ask me this question like, well, how can I approach this person? Who is it okay for me to ask them about the culture that they grew up in or to kind of get into that kind of conversation with them? And I always say depends, right? And it depends on the relationship you have with that person, what your relationship goals are with that person, and also the degree to which you've asked yourself those questions, because I think that having that self-awareness is so crucial as a leader, right? And so walking into that conversation already having examined for yourself, okay, what are these biases or assumptions or tendencies or characteristics that I have, and how might they be coming into play? And then approaching someone from a place of vulnerability, right? So it's I know this thing about myself, I know I have this strength, and I also know that I have this challenge in terms of the way I communicate. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what kind of stories did you grow up hearing about communication? And so that empowerment, it takes away this fear that people tend to enter into a conversation like that.
I like that. Because now it's making me think about something that I've thought about, that I've had conversations with teams when I'm busy facilitating team building. You mentioned very clearly, really thinking through how you would approach this person, whether you have thought about the same questions for yourself. Now, as a manager or a leader, how do we navigate or how do we cultivate conversations amongst the team, and so that it doesn't end up only being a one-on-one conversation, but where we have the whole team, and ensure that it's a productive conversation on intercultural competence, or it's a productive conversation on our differences and celebrating them instead of trying to minimize or shove them aside and say, hey, that's not important. This is not what we're doing right now. How do you suggest we as leaders cultivate conversations like that within our teams?
Yeah, I think that first it's important to just name the intention, right? The intention that we acknowledge and respect and value different perspectives and lived experiences, and naming that as a core value of your team, right? And also, as a result, creating spaces where team members feel safe to share their perspectives and challenge the status quo assumption on the team, right? We've all been there where everybody's pretty much in agreement that this is how we should charge forward, on this project. And then, but in the back of your mind, you're saying, we haven't thought about this thing, but I don't know if I can actually speak up and say that. And so actually drawing forth and encouraging that kind of sharing of perspective and challenging of assumptions without fear of retaliation or look, hey, just get with the program, with everybody else kind of an attitude. And so as a leader, it's up to us to kind of set that tone, right? I think starting conversation, having these facilitated perhaps conversations around culture. I love this idea of teams just doing a version of speed dating where we talk, maybe one-on-one or in small groups, answering questions about our stories. And at a level that feels appropriate to the workplace, but also that goes beyond this kind of surface level, get to know you type questions, right? Having spaces like that, and perhaps even having facilitated conversations around culture by consultants and people like myself who actually kind of specialize in these kinds of conversations. And then leaders can model curiosity, right? They can also model vulnerability. I think that's a huge one, is vulnerability in this case, by sharing their own cultural stories and inviting team members to do the same and providing learning opportunities, right? For teams to delve more into the learning, but also developing the skills that are behind intercultural competence and relating across differences.
That's really helpful. I think what I appreciate the most is probably your honesty around the fact that it's worth getting a consultant in to facilitate the conversation. You don't have to necessarily, as the leader, you don't have to facilitate that conversation. And maybe it might create a more productive environment when you get an outsider facilitating this conversation. Because I have been in spaces, and I'm sure my listeners have been too, where we are in a room with a leader trying to facilitate a conversation, whether it's around values or around giving productive feedback. But we already know each person. You can say it's a safe space. You get to say what you want. But we've had the shared experience of speaking up and having someone retaliate or having someone push back. And that doesn't necessarily give me the confidence that what would make the situation different. So I think when we get those consultants and someone like you coming in fresh, that already changes the context and hopefully allows it to be a more productive conversation.
Yeah, it changes the dynamic for sure. Like I always say, you can blame me. I'm the outsider, the consultant that comes in and, later on you can talk bad about me or whatever. No, actually it ends up being really, really positive, uplifting conversations when done right. And so, to your point, one of the ways to approach this is from a more objective point of view, right? Because there are all these stories, all these different stories, and they're all equally valuable, right? So how do we decide how to approach this thing? And so when you have objective data, I think it's so powerful, right? So I talked about the intercultural development inventory, and it measures intercultural competence. And so it gives us this mirror. It's this gift that allows us to be able to see ourselves as individuals and as teams. How are we actually as a team managing the differences within our team and between us and the outside world? But then having the gift of that, objective data about us as individuals as well, helps guide us in a way that our defenses can come down, right?
Mhm.
There's no like right or wrong, good or bad about it. It's just, okay, it tells you a little bit more about how you're handling certain ways of communicating, how you're managing conflict. And then with that information, you can move forward. You have information, you have like a path or a roadmap that helps you to move forward in your development based on whatever your individual goals are. So it's not this like browbeating or telling people that they're this, that, or the other thing, but it's just approaching from a perspective of we have this objective data and we can very intentionally move forward.
Thank you for that. Now, coming back to the Intercultural Development Inventory, the IDI, can you share a specific example of how understanding and appreciating cultural differences led to a breakthrough moment or innovative solution within a team you've worked with?
Yeah. So I really love working with organizations with global missions, right? I mentioned I used to work in international education. I also love to work with companies who are working across borders or maybe have employees that are from different countries or cultures and working with target markets from various places around the world. And so an example is an international education organization that I've worked with. And I really like organizations that are change makers, right? So they've identified an issue within the field or the industry or or systems that they want to impact change in. And this particular organization was an organization whose mission was to provide study abroad and cultural exchange experiences to people, to students from all walks of life, right? And didn't matter like what your financial background or ability was, didn't matter, what your race, ethnicity, et cetera, was. They wanted to, in a way, kind of democratize this amazing thing, which is the ability to be able to go to another place and another culture and learn about others, right? And so I came in as a consultant and I did an assessment of the intercultural development inventory for their team. And they then realized that they were in this stage of intercultural competence called minimization. And I mentioned a little bit about that earlier, right? So this idea that let's minimize the differences, focus on what we have in common. To the detriment of managing differences that make a difference. And those differences were showing up, right? So they had, in terms of their employee surveys, there was a lot of discontent around this tendency to minimize, right? And lack of acknowledgement of important differences. There was also kind of this disconnect between the communities that they were serving and themselves, not only in the makeup of the team in terms of like, there really weren't a lot of folks who were like a vast majority of the communities they served were students of color, and they didn't have a lot of people of color on their team. So they recognized that was, a challenge for them. They also were having retention issues. So all of these things they came to me with. And once they were able to see, we're in minimization and really understand what that meant and kind of go through like how that's showing up for us. Oh yeah, we can identify in our student programs, minimization is showing up in this way. In the way we hire, we're even minimizing, et cetera, et cetera. And so we kind of did this whole systematic look at like, where was that showing up and how is it hindering them from their goals? And then again, systematically and intentionally working through how they could reach their goals. And so one of the things that they ended up doing is they started to collect demographic data in a way that they hadn't before, right?
Of the team itself?
Both the team and the communities that they were serving.
Oh, cool. Oh, wow. Fantastic.
Right. At a level that they hadn't been before. And because they realized that's a form of minimization, right? Whenever you are saying, well, we don't need to know this information about the student, or we don't need to collect this kind of data about our employees. It's an assumption that why? Because there's no big differences, right? And so once they realized that, they started collecting data, much more data to understand the employee experience and their target market experiences. And they started then, they were able to through these surveys, they were able to pull out and say, oh, this is what's happening for this, particular group of students. Our trans students are not feeling seen in our programs, et cetera, et cetera. And then in that way, they were able to become much more responsive, both internally and externally. They ended up becoming a great place to work through a series of interventions and facilitations and work that we did. Their student survey numbers also started to increase. One of the things that they did for the first time is they started providing neutral gender housing for their students. So because that was identified as something that was needed. And so there was so many ways that they were able to just kind of then pivot and be much more accountable and adaptable and responsive to their organization and to their communities.
Wow. So collecting data is one of the key pieces, or probably one of the essential ones if you want to really focus on cultivating intercultural differences, but really getting to understand that. Now we can collect data until the end of time, but if you could give us 3 key pieces of data that would be helpful as leaders or organizations to collect, what would you recommend?
Well, I would say start with, what are the challenges that we're faced with right now, right? Are our challenges in retention? Are our challenges with regard to employee satisfaction? Are they related to, well, we're not quite able to reach this target market that we really want to have been trying to go for, but they're not responding to us? And so start from there. And then you can drill down to what data you need more of, right? So if it's, related to, oh, we have this target market, but nobody on our team is a part of that community or that culture, then starting to identify demographically, what do we have on our team and what are we missing? And also learning more, obviously finding more from those communities of what are their needs? The answer is there's no 1, 2, 3, these types of information, but I think it all just really depends on what your goals are as an organization.
That's helpful. You've mentioned a phrase a few times, and I want to drill into that before I let you go. You mentioned minimization. And the question that I have for you is, thinking about myself as a female leader, thinking about my female leaders who are listening to us having this conversation.
Yes.
How have you found that female leaders tend to minimize themselves? And what would you recommend we do instead?
Oh my gosh, Katie, that's a huge question. I think it's a really big one, top of mind for me, because I do see a lot of women leaders in minimization. And it's this kind of go along to get along type of a feeling. And so how do we stay below the radar? How do we not stand out too much? How do we fit in, right? That's the desire, that we need to do all those things in order to be successful. I don't know if you remember that at the graduation from the 1 Million Black Women program, there was this author, Maury Tahir. Yeah,
I love her.
So good.
I love her.
She was so good. She has this book called Bring Yourself, and it's all about negotiating with your authentic self, right? And she has this part of the book where she throughout, but specifically addresses women and how we tend to negotiate. And women tend to think that we have to be like everyone else around us in order to succeed. And so if you're in a male-dominated field like tech, et cetera, you may notice a certain way of communicating or negotiating or within your field, and you kind of try to fit that mold. And so what she says is a lot of us don't realize what a strength we have in terms of some of the characteristics or skills that women tend to be exceptionally good at: emotional intelligence, compassion, adaptability, flexibility, all those things. And so she really says we need to lean into those, and obviously it's a generalization, right? Like not every woman is going to be, the most emotionally intelligent, et cetera. But, if we have that skill, play up that skill, because actually that can be a strength for you. And so emotional intelligence is important for everyone.
It's huge. If we all were a little bit more emotionally intelligent, we'd probably be a lot more productive and we'd get a lot more done and collaborate. So yes, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah. And there's this story that I like to tell. It's kind of this fictional story that I heard from one of my intercultural leadership facilitators or trainers at the beginning of my career. And she said that, there was this department within a university, and the department tended to be mostly men. And then there were like a few women, right? And who were the minority. And that someone noticed that there were like all of the men in their offices and on their office doors, like had like their children's artwork up, or they had pictures of their children or their families or whatever. But the women tended not to have those pictures. And I mean, I guess you probably understand where that's where that story's going, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, it was like this like desire to like, I don't want to be thought of as like, oh, I'm not going to be a good professor or a good employee or a dedicated worker because, I have this family that I have to tend to, or that I am not going to be as dedicated because I have children. And so the women in this case were minimizing, right? They were actually minimizing their strengths, because you know this, right? As a parent. Yeah. I mean, like, I'm sure you developed some mad skills when you became a parent, right? In terms of communication.
Multitasking. Oh, yes. Yes.
Negotiation, conflict, all those things. Like, and so like, actually, having a family, having children, I don't have a family or children, but I know that those can be huge ways to develop these skills, and we should use them as strengths. And put them forward and not be ashamed or feel the need to hide parts of ourselves because we think that is actually better for us when it's actually hurting us.
Oh my gosh. Listening to you, Jackie, reminds me of the McKinsey and Leading Women in the Workplace study that comes out every year. And it talks a lot about the assumptions that women have around their image in the workplace. Yes. And yes, I can absolutely agree with that. I mean, when I was in my 30s, I remember specifically trying to conform, trying to fit in, and trying to make sure that I didn't ruffle feathers. I didn't stand out. I didn't speak too differently than everybody else.
Right.
And until you and I had this conversation, what was it, a couple of months ago, I did not even realize to what level I was minimizing at that time. And I have to keep catching myself when I start saying something. It's like, wait a minute, I take that back. And I sometimes verbally, I have to actually say, oh, wait a second, I take that back. What I actually wanted to say was the following. So it's really powerful to understand, number one. So coming back to that self-awareness that you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, understanding, being aware of how do we minimize ourselves and what can we do instead? And how can we not only celebrate our strengths, but really, lack of a better word, lean into what we already do so really well. If we are good at negotiating with our kids and our spouses, why would we not use those skills? If we are good at communicating, because sometimes you have to say the same thing 5 times before your young child does something, that is a skill. Why are we not leaning into that? Because I remember I'm halfway through the book that you just mentioned, Maury's book. I remember at the beginning, she talks about this man and woman who were on the team to practice this negotiation skills. So he was very aggressive out there, very direct. And she thought that she had to be like him. It was a case of all or nothing. Someone has to win, someone has to lose. And so they got to a stalemate. At one point, they decided, okay, this is never going to work. So the woman changed who she was. Instead of showing up as her authentic self and saying,
Yes.
I'm a collaborator, I believe in a win-win solution, she shifted her thinking, and that was to the detriment of them both. So thank you for highlighting that. And if you could leave us with one last thought around how we can catch ourselves with minimization, what would you say we could focus on?
I think the awareness of it is such an important step, right? Because like you said, just a couple of months ago, you may not have even been aware of something that maybe was a tendency of yours for like years and years. And I can say the same thing. Like for years, all I wanted to do was just like put my head down, like nobody noticed me. I'm just fitting in, kind of a thing.
Yes.
And so I can relate. I spent years and years in minimization, but I think becoming aware is like such a gift. And I don't want to de-emphasize that or like gloss over it and say, okay, now you need to do this, this, and this, because it really is a journey. It's a lifelong journey. I continue to develop my intercultural competence every day. I mess up, I say the wrong thing, and I sometimes minimize myself, but giving yourself the grace once you've recognized that it's happening, and realizing too that like there's no good or bad, right or wrong. It is a coping mechanism that helped you to survive until now, right? To thrive until now. And so just being able to like not beating yourself up about it, but just saying, this got you to where you are. Like there's nothing wrong with where you are. And then deciding for yourself, do you want to continue to go in the same direction? Or is there something new that, a new part of you that you want to flourish and come out in this next chapter, right? And if you want something new, then that's the moment for you to say, okay, what might I do differently?
Thank you.
I mean, I love this work. It really gets me excited just talking about it, just because of like what you said, like these individual breakthroughs that come through all the time with people when they get a chance to learn about themselves and be more authentically themselves.
Yes. Oh my gosh, Jackie, thank you so much. You are such a gift with the work that you do, your vulnerability, and simply your reminder not to judge ourselves. That is an absolute gift, because I know for myself as a recovering perfectionist, the first thing I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm doing this, I'm doing it wrong, I got to fix it, I have to do it perfectly. But thank you for the reminder that we can thank ourselves for where we are. We've used these coping mechanisms to protect ourselves, to get where we are, to reach the success we've had. And now we have the opportunity to make a new decision, to decide, now that I have the self-awareness, where do I want to go? What impact do I want to have? How do I want to show up? And perhaps even what legacy do I want to leave my children, my nephews and nieces, the women coming up behind me? So thank you for really sharing that with us. I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course.
So you mentioned a book by Maury, and I will share links to the book in the show notes. I have no connection with Maury. I was in the same graduation as Jackie, and we really, really took to her. So I will share that book on Amazon so you can take a look at it. If you had to recommend any other books, 1 to 2 books or podcasts that you would recommend my listeners tune into or take a look at, what would you recommend?
Okay, there's this book. I never thought of it that way. How to have fearlessly curious conversations in dangerously divided times. It's by Monica Guzman.
Oh my gosh.
Particularly relevant right now.
Yes.
With the political polarization
Absolutely.
that's happening in our country. And so, yeah.
Oh, it could not have come at a better time. It's January. We all know what's happening around January 19th, January 20th, and we all have different thoughts and ideas. Go take a look at that book. I will share a link to the book in the show notes. Again, Jackie and I have no connection to the book, but go take a look and empower yourself in 2025 to make decisions and to have the conversations that you've been burning to have. Jackie, before I let you go, how can my listeners find you? How can they work with you? And how can they stay in touch with you?
Yeah. So the best way to stay in touch with me is on my LinkedIn, and it's Jackie Broussard. Yeah, I mean, I think that's just a great place to start. I post a lot of things about the topics that we talked about today. I'll post about my own personal experiences in intercultural development. And then kind of like, what breakthroughs I've had with clients, et cetera. So you can learn more about those things there. And I also have a newsletter, which it's in the title of my LinkedIn that people can subscribe to if they want to be part of my newsletter community.
Beautiful. Jackie, thank you so much. Oh, and what Jackie forgot, maybe she mentioned, maybe she didn't. What you didn't mention is the LinkedIn Live series that you do. How often do you do it?
So it's monthly.
Okay.
Thank you for reminding me of all the things. Keely, it's like never feels like I forget about something or another to tell people about.
We all do.
Yeah. So it's called The Power of Us, Conversations for Change.
Oh, yes, please.
And it's just all about like what we've talked about today. Our first episode of the year will be January 22nd. And we'll be talking about how we navigate equity and inclusion, how we become inclusive leaders across borders. And so that will be our first topic. It's for anyone who wants to practice more inclusive leadership and become more interculturally competent in managing teams and just in having better, more positive relationships. So.
Oh my goodness. I will definitely be tuning in on January 22nd. Thank you, Jackie. I look forward to hearing more how your series develops and the incredible guests that you sometimes have on your series. Thank you again for your time. I will link to Jackie's LinkedIn, to her website, and in the show notes. So please go take a look at her. You can only learn from what Jackie has to share. I've known Jackie for a while. We reconnected through the Goldman Sachs program, and this has been such a fun conversation. I look forward to having way more conversations because this is a crucial topic, and now more than ever before.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me, Keely. I loved it. I love the conversation.
Thank you, Jackie. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
And that's a wrap for my conversation with the amazing Jackie Broussard. I had so much fun learning about all the intricacies of intercultural communication. Some of the things that I'm taking with me and that I hope that you are taking with you are things such as intercultural development inventory. Go check that out. And the intercultural conflict style inventory. We can learn so much. And the more self-aware we are, the easier it becomes to know and understand when we are minimizing ourselves as women. Because the more self-aware we become, the more empowered we are to create spaces where our teams feel seen, they feel heard, and they are doing their best work. So if you enjoyed today's episode as much as I did, please go show Jackie some love. Go follow her on LinkedIn. Go check out her newsletter. I think it comes out every Friday. So yes, go follow her. And if you enjoy the podcast episode, please let me know. If you want to have Jackie back on the show, let me know that too. Thank you for joining me on Communicate to Lead today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your network, subscribe to the podcast, and leave a review. And remember, your voice matters, your leadership matters, and I'm here to support you every step of the way. Until next week, my friend, I am Keely, reminding you that great communication is the foundation of inspiring leadership. Keep learning, keep growing, and remember to communicate to lead.